In the spring of 1945, the Pacific Ocean no longer resembled a battlefield. It resembled a graveyard that stretched beyond the horizon. Countless shipwrecks floated like ghosts of steel, their twisted frames marking the invisible lines where convoys had once passed. Oil slicks shimmered under the sun, mixing with debris from torpedoed transports and bombed freighters. Between these remnants drifted small groups of survivors, faces burnt by salt and wind, skin blistered by days of exposure, eyes hollow from thirst. Some clung to makeshift rafts of planks and barrels, others floated in life vests already bleached white by the tropical sun. They were soldiers, nurses, fishermen, and civilians, all caught in the same indifferent sea that now refused to distinguish between nations or uniforms. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its final, most destructive phase. Naval battles no longer unfolded in grand maneuvers but in chaotic encounters, submarine ambushes, airstrikes, and the relentless bombing of supply routes. Each engagement left behind more than wreckage. It left behind people. Survivors from sunken Japanese transports, Allied hospital ships, and civilian freighters were scattered across vast expanses of ocean. Many had been adrift for days before an American vessel even sighted them. When they were finally spotted, they often looked less like survivors than like fragments of the sea itself, motionless, swollen from dehydration, barely alive. For the sailors of the U.S. Navy, these encounters posed an agonizing moral test. The official orders were clear: no ship was to endanger itself unnecessarily. Enemy survivors could be armed, boats could be rigged with explosives, and every approach might be a trap. War had taught them suspicion as a form of survival. Yet the sea had its own code, older than any naval directive, a duty as ancient as sailing itself. No one was to be left to die on the water. That unwritten law often clashed with the written one, forcing men to decide, in a moment, which voice they would obey. Most of these rescues were not recorded in dispatches or celebrated in newspapers. They happened far from cameras, in places where no one expected mercy to exist. A destroyer escorting a convoy might stop for a single figure waving weakly from a raft. A minesweeper might find a capsized fishing boat, its deck littered with empty rice sacks and the bodies of civilians. Even a hospital ship, already overloaded with wounded, might alter course to pick up another drifting soul. Every time, the same ritual repeated: ropes were thrown, water passed down, blankets wrapped around trembling shoulders. The survivors came from every side of the conflict. There were Japanese nurses from hospital barges, Korean laborers forced to sea on supply transports, and Filipino fishermen whose villages had been destroyed by air raids. For the Americans, their identities blurred in the face of simple human suffering. These were no longer enemies or allies, just people stripped of every marker except the need to live. As the Pacific campaign neared its end, the ocean itself became a vast, floating testament to both destruction and compassion. The U.S. Navy's warships, built for battle, found themselves performing acts of rescue that belonged to another kind of duty. Between the thunder of bombardments and the silence of the waves, there existed brief moments when the war's machinery paused, and sailors became simply men confronted with the fragility of life. In those moments, when hands reached down from gray decks to pull the half-dead from the sea, the boundaries of the conflict dissolved. The same ocean that had devoured fleets now carried the faintest echo of mercy. Every rescued life was an act of defiance against the logic of total war. And though these gestures left no medals and rarely entered reports, they formed an invisible current running through the last year of the Pacific campaign, a current of humanity that refused to sink, even when everything else had. The problem was never the absence of compassion, it was the presence of danger. Every decision to rescue carried the weight of uncertainty. The Pacific in 1945 was not only a battleground but a theater of deception, where survival and strategy constantly blurred. American naval crews knew that not every distress signal was what it seemed. The Japanese had, on rare occasions, used feigned distress to lure in Allied vessels. There were documented instances in earlier years of the war when enemy troops pretended to surrender, only to detonate explosives or open fire once ships came within range. These stories circulated through the fleet like warnings carved into memory, turning every act of mercy into a gamble with death. Naval instructions reflected this reality. U.S. Navy operational orders advised captains to assess every rescue situation with extreme caution. If there was any indication of enemy activity, floating mines, nearby aircraft, or the possibility of ambush, ships were to maintain course and avoid direct contact. Even a small boat adrift could conceal danger, a single explosive charge, or a torpedo waiting beneath the waves. The enemy's desperation, commanders feared, could easily become a weapon. It was not cynicism, it was the cold arithmetic of survival. For the men aboard destroyers and escort ships, this dilemma was deeply personal. They had been trained to fight efficiently, to react without hesitation, to calculate risks like engineers. Yet when they looked down from the deck and saw a human figure clinging to a splintered plank, instinct and regulation collided. To lower a boat meant exposing sailors to sniper fire or submarines lurking below. To turn away meant letting someone drown. Between those two choices stretched a silence that only the sea could hold. The Pacific War had magnified every fear. Japanese submarine captains had learned to exploit compassion by staging decoy wrecks, leaving rafts adrift as distractions while they slipped into attack positions. American records from 1943 and 1944 noted several such incidents, and though by 1945 they were less frequent, the memory of them lingered. Crews were reminded that hesitation could cost hundreds of lives. Mines drifted freely after storms and sinkings, many of them broken loose from defensive nets, turning entire areas into lethal traps for anyone attempting rescue. At the same time, communication in those vast waters was unreliable. Radio signals often failed or arrived garbled. A captain making the decision to stop for survivors had to rely solely on what he saw through binoculars. Tiny forms rising and falling with the swells, sometimes waving weakly, sometimes motionless. There was rarely confirmation of who they were until it was too late to change course. Even when survivors were brought aboard, uncertainty did not end. They could be enemy sailors, armed or pretending to be civilians. Standard procedure required a search and a medical check before any contact, but hunger and exhaustion often forced immediate aid. Medics knew that delay could kill, yet guards stood nearby, rifles ready, unsure if mercy might turn into betrayal. It was a cruel paradox of the Pacific War. To save others, sailors had to risk themselves. And yet, despite every warning, despite the official cautions and the shadow of suspicion, the instinct to help rarely vanished. Many sailors carried their own memories of disaster, the friends lost to sinking ships, the faces seen once in the water and never again. They knew what it meant to wait for a hand that might not come. That knowledge made the danger feel smaller, and the obligation larger. To rescue someone in wartime was not a gesture of strategy but of defiance. Every time a rope was thrown into the sea, the crew broke the logic of total war that demanded only destruction. They knew they might be punished for taking unnecessary risks, but most captains quietly chose to act, trusting their judgment and their conscience. In those moments, each ship ceased to be only a weapon of war. It became an island, fragile, human, and fleeting, where compassion survived amid the machinery of death. The problem, therefore, was never simply operational. It was moral. Between orders and instinct, between fear and duty, the American sailors stood suspended, surrounded by an ocean that erased every difference except one, the difference between letting someone drown and choosing to save them. By the final year of the Pacific War, the United States Navy had developed one of the largest and most advanced hospital fleets in military history. These ships were floating cities of medicine, designed not for combat but for survival. They moved silently through the same waters where convoys burned and submarines hunted, their white hulls marked with massive red crosses visible from miles away. According to the Hague and Geneva Conventions, they were protected vessels, neutral under international law, but in practice, that protection often depended on the mercy of the enemy and the chaos of battle. The U.S. Navy's hospital fleet began expanding in 1943, as the scale of the Pacific Campaign made it clear that land-based hospitals could no longer handle the volume of casualties. Ships such as the USS Comfort, AH-6, USS Hope, AH-7, and USS Mercy, AH-8, were converted from merchant hulls and equipped with operating rooms, laboratories, X-ray units, and up to 500 hospital beds. They were staffed by Navy doctors, corpsmen, and members of the Army Nurse Corps, some of the first American women to serve so close to active combat zones. Their mission was to receive the wounded directly from beachheads, stabilize them, and ferry them to safer ports in places like Guam, Leyte, or Hawaii. The scale of these operations was extraordinary. During the liberation of the Philippines and the invasion of Okinawa, hospital ships shuttled back and forth continuously, often under threat of attack. Each vessel carried not only medical supplies but also desalination equipment, refrigeration units for blood storage, and power systems capable of sustaining surgical operations around the clock. For many wounded soldiers, these ships were the first place they encountered silence after weeks of gunfire, the first sign that they might live. But the humanitarian mission of these ships went beyond treating Allied personnel. In the final months of the war, as Japanese resistance crumbled and the Pacific filled with shipwrecks and displaced civilians, American hospital ships and destroyers began picking up survivors of all kinds: Japanese sailors, Korean laborers, and even civilians rescued from bombed fishing vessels or transport ships. Though regulations required segregation between enemy and Allied patients, in practice, many American medics treated whoever arrived on deck. Pain and exhaustion blurred the boundaries of nationality. USS Comfort became a symbol of both heroism and vulnerability. On April 28, 1945, while operating near Okinawa, it was struck by a Japanese kamikaze aircraft. The plane crashed directly into the ship's hospital ward, killing 28 people, including 6 nurses and several patients. The vessel burned for hours, yet its crew continued to work, performing surgeries amid the wreckage to save the wounded. The attack shocked the U.S. Navy and underscored the brutal reality that even hospital ships, despite their neutral markings, were not immune to war's reach. Other ships carried on. USS Hope and USS Mercy operated along the Philippine coast, bringing aboard hundreds of survivors from torpedoed transports. Later, during the occupation of Japan, the USS Benevolence, AH-13, and USS Consolation, AH-15, anchored in Tokyo Bay as part of the postwar humanitarian mission. When Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, Benevolence lay nearby, receiving released Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees who had endured years of starvation and forced labor. Medical teams documented cases of scurvy, malaria, beriberi, and extreme malnutrition. For many of those rescued, a hospital ship became the first place where they tasted fresh water and food in years. The presence of these ships in Tokyo Bay marked a quiet but significant turning point. The same navy that had once been tasked with destroying Japan's maritime power now carried out acts of restoration. Food, medical care, and repatriation became the new logistics of peace. From the decks of USS Benevolence and Consolation, American medics and Japanese interpreters worked side by side, tending to those who had survived the war's worst cruelties. By the end of 1945, hospital ships had transported more than 350,000 patients across the Pacific. They had treated Allied troops, Japanese prisoners, and civilians alike. Their missions blurred the line between military necessity and humanitarian duty, showing that even in total war, compassion could find its place among strategy and steel. These floating hospitals stood as the moral counterweight to the destruction that surrounded them, a reminder that technology, when guided by empathy rather than vengeance, could heal as effectively as it had once harmed. The defining catalyst for the humanitarian image of the Allied fleets in the Pacific came not at the end of the war, but in the middle of it, on a quiet May morning in 1943, off the coast of Queensland, Australia. The waters east of Brisbane were calm when the Australian hospital ship AHS Centaur, brightly painted white with red crosses illuminated on her sides, steamed northward toward New Guinea. On board were 332 people: doctors, nurses, orderlies, crewmen, and members of the Australian Army Medical Corps. The ship was unarmed and clearly marked in accordance with the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Geneva Convention of 1929, which guaranteed protection to hospital ships under international law. But war had long since blurred the lines between what was protected and what was expendable. At 4:10 a.m. on May 14, 1943, a single torpedo from the Japanese submarine I-177 struck Centaur on the port side, igniting the fuel tanks and engulfing the ship in flames. The explosion was so violent that the vessel sank within 3 minutes. There was no time to launch lifeboats, no chance to organize evacuation. The blast hurled survivors into the dark, oil-slicked water. Many were burned, some blinded by flaming fuel, others trapped beneath debris. For hours, those whose surface drifted among the wreckage, clinging to pieces of timber, medical chests, and life rafts that had floated free. The attack shocked even those hardened by years of war. Under the Geneva and Hague Conventions, the deliberate sinking of a marked hospital ship was a war crime. Yet no help could come immediately. The survivors, 64 in all, spent more than 35 hours adrift in the open sea, exposed to the tropical sun by day and chilled by wind at night. Several died of exhaustion before rescue arrived. The first Allied vessel to reach them was the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Mugford, DD-389, operating out of Brisbane as part of convoy escort duties. Mugford had already earned a reputation for discipline and resilience, having survived the attack on Pearl Harbor and intense combat in the Guadalcanal campaign. When the signal came reporting survivors from a torpedoed vessel, the crew assumed it was another merchant ship. Only when they approached the site and saw burned medical equipment and fragments of white-painted hulls marked with red crosses did they realize the magnitude of what had happened. The men aboard Mugford began the rescue immediately. The seas were still rough, and oil covered much of the surface, making it difficult to spot the survivors. Sailors used ropes and cargo nets to haul people aboard. Some survivors were too weak to climb, their hands slipping from the oil. The crew lowered stretchers and even descended into the water themselves to lift the injured out. One sailor later wrote that the survivors' faces were ashen, their lips split from thirst, their skin raw from salt. Many wore remnants of burned uniforms or hospital smocks, some had nothing but life belts. The destroyer's medical team converted the wardroom and mess deck into makeshift triage areas. Navy corpsmen treated severe burns, fractures, and dehydration using whatever supplies they had. The ship's fresh water was rationed, but the crew shared their personal canteens freely. Galley cooks opened tins of soup and crackers, breaking their own rations to feed the rescued. Blankets were brought from the sailors' bunks, and hammocks were slung along the passageways for the weakest. There was no distinction between Australian and American, soldier or civilian, doctor or deckhand, only the urgent need to keep them alive until landfall. By the time Mugford reached Brisbane, more than 36 hours after the sinking, many of the rescued were unconscious or delirious. Australian hospitals received them directly from the docks, and the news of the attack spread quickly through Allied headquarters. The deliberate sinking of a hospital ship caused international outrage. Newspapers in Sydney, London, and Washington printed the survivors' testimonies, calling it one of the most brutal violations of maritime law in the Pacific War. For the crew of the USS Mugford, however, the incident was not remembered as an act of vengeance but as a moral test. They had encountered the consequences of total war stripped of disguise, human beings destroyed in the act of trying to save others. The image of those burned survivors being pulled from the oil-stained sea stayed with many sailors long after the war ended. Their quiet compassion, their decision to give up their own water and food for strangers, became an unspoken statement of resistance against the dehumanization that war imposed. The Centaur tragedy became one of the clearest examples of how mercy and atrocity could coexist in the same ocean. It revealed not only the vulnerability of humanitarian efforts in wartime but also the unyielding instinct to preserve life in the face of deliberate destruction. For the U.S. sailors who reached into the burning waters that day, the rescue of the Centaur's survivors marked a moment when the purpose of their voyage shifted, from waging war to reaffirming what it meant to remain human at sea. The process of maritime rescue during the Pacific War was as methodical as it was humane, shaped by centuries of naval tradition and adapted to the brutal realities of 20th-century warfare. By 1945, the United States Navy had developed standardized procedures for recovering survivors from the sea, procedures that balanced operational security with the ancient obligation to save life. These actions, repeated across countless ships and convoys, formed a quiet undercurrent of compassion running beneath the machinery of total war. The sequence always began with security. When floating survivors were sighted, the officer of the deck would sound a general alert, and the ship's guns and lookouts would go to readiness. The crew scanned the horizon for periscopes, enemy aircraft, or mines, since even an act of mercy could be a prelude to ambush. Only when the area was declared clear did the captain authorize rescue operations. The ship slowed or stopped engines, and sailors threw lines, flotation rings, or cargo nets over the side. On destroyers and transports, small motor whaleboats, or life rafts were lowered to approach survivors if sea conditions allowed. The moment of contact was often chaotic. Survivors, exhausted, burned, or delirious, could rarely climb on their own. Sailors had to enter the water or lean dangerously over the railings, pulling people upward by their arms or under their shoulders. Oil slicks from torpedoed ships coated both rescuers and rescued, making every movement slippery and hazardous. Many survivors were covered in fuel, seawater, and blood. Before being brought fully aboard, they were often rinsed with seawater hoses to remove the worst contamination. Once on deck, the process shifted from rescue to recovery. Naval medical corpsmen took charge, assessing who could stand, who required immediate treatment, and who was beyond help. Blankets were issued to prevent hypothermia, though in the tropical Pacific the greater threat was dehydration and heat stroke. Survivors were laid out in shaded areas, sometimes on tarpaulins or canvas stretchers arranged in rows. The ship's sick bay was usually small, so ordinary compartments, mess decks, hallways, even gun platforms, were temporarily converted into treatment areas. Water was always the first medicine. Because many rescued had gone days without drinking, medics followed a strict rule: no more than a few mouthfuls at a time, to avoid shock or vomiting. Food came next, usually in the form of small pieces of hardtack, soup, or watered-down broth. The U.S. Navy's K&C rations, intended for combat troops, became emergency sustenance for strangers pulled from the ocean. Sailors routinely shared their personal rations, coffee, biscuits, canned fruit, without hesitation. In many cases, these supplies were the difference between life and death for the rescued. For burns and exposure, the limited medical kits on combat ships offered only basic remedies: sulfadiazine ointment, iodine, and bandages made from torn bedsheets or gauze. On larger ships or hospital vessels, treatment followed precise protocols. Nurses and doctors cleaned wounds, applied dressings, and recorded each patient's condition. Vital signs were checked hourly, and records were kept, even for enemy survivors, in accordance with international law. The U.S. Navy had adopted these humanitarian standards as part of its standing orders, and while they were not always enforceable in combat, most commanders upheld them as a matter of moral and professional pride. At night, the rescued were placed in designated rest areas, often below deck, away from machinery noise. Sailors stood watch nearby, providing water or comfort through the long hours until transfer. When hospital ships were present, coordination between vessels became seamless. Radio communications directed the exchange of wounded. Destroyers and transports delivered survivors to the white-painted medical ships, which could treat hundreds at once. On board those floating hospitals, the process was executed with almost industrial precision: patients admitted, logged, cleaned, treated, and fed within minutes of arrival. Every phase of this process reflected both discipline and empathy. It was not spontaneous heroism, but a structured ritual of decency, repeated so often that it became instinctive. The sailors who performed it rarely considered themselves extraordinary. They understood that the sea was impartial, and that anyone could become the next figure struggling in the waves. In a war defined by machines and statistics, this routine act, throwing a rope, offering a cup of water, sharing a meal, was the last surviving trace of an older kind of honor. This pattern repeated from the Coral Sea to Okinawa, across thousands of miles of ocean. Whether it involved Allied comrades or former enemies, the process was the same: secure, recover, feed, heal. In the logs it appeared as a few short lines. Survivors recovered. Given food and water. Transferred to hospital ship. But behind those lines lay hours of labor, risk, and quiet compassion. In the vast, indifferent Pacific, rescue had become a science of mercy, a disciplined choreography through which the U.S. Navy preserved not just lives, but the meaning of humanity itself. The field experience of the U.S. Navy's hospital ships in the final months of the Pacific War revealed the fragility of compassion in a world consumed by destruction. Though marked with large red crosses and officially protected under the Geneva Convention, these vessels often operated perilously close to the front, where the distinction between a combatant and a non-combatant blurred beneath the roar of engines and the glare of tracer fire. Their work demanded constant movement through contested waters, and their survival depended not only on neutrality but on luck. The most tragic example came on the night of April 28, 1945, when the hospital ship USS Comfort, AH-6, was struck by a Japanese kamikaze while anchored off Okinawa. Comfort was a 10,000-ton vessel, built specifically to transport and treat the wounded from some of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. Her decks contained operating rooms, wards, and recovery spaces, manned by Navy doctors and Army nurses who had been working without rest since the start of the Okinawa campaign 3 weeks earlier. The ship's lights were dimmed, but her red crosses were fully illuminated in accordance with wartime regulations, visible to aircraft approaching from any direction. Shortly after 8 p.m., a single Japanese plane, a twin-engine Mitsubishi Ki-51, Sonia, appeared on radar. At first, the crew assumed it would pass by. Comfort carried no weapons. Hospital ships were forbidden from engaging in combat. But within seconds, the aircraft dived directly toward the vessel's midsection. The impact was devastating. The kamikaze crashed through the starboard side and exploded inside the surgical ward, killing 28 people, including 6 nurses, 4 doctors, and several patients who had already been under anesthesia. The blast destroyed much of the ward, ignited fires across multiple decks, and ruptured medical oxygen lines. For several minutes, chaos consumed the ship. Flames tore through the wards, and electrical systems failed. Yet, even as smoke filled the corridors, the surviving medical staff acted with the same discipline they had shown in surgery. Nurses and corpsmen carried the wounded to the upper decks, shielding them from falling debris. Doctors whose hands had been burned continued performing triage by flashlight. The Comfort's commanding officer, Captain Thomas Dent, ordered emergency teams to seal the lower compartments and contain the fire. Sailors used hand pumps and blankets soaked in seawater to smother flames. By midnight, the fires were under control, and the ship remained afloat. When dawn came, the full extent of the tragedy was clear. Nearly every person killed had been part of the medical crew. The operating theater was gone, and parts of the ship were twisted beyond repair. Yet Comfort did not withdraw from duty. Instead, her crew converted the remaining wards into functioning treatment areas and continued receiving patients from Okinawa. The wounded were transferred to other hospital ships, including USS Hope and USS Mercy, while Comfort limped back to Guam for temporary repairs. The ship's surviving nurses refused evacuation until all patients were safely transferred. Their insistence became a symbol of unbreakable professional duty. News of the attack spread rapidly through Allied fleets. The deliberate targeting of a hospital ship shocked commanders and medical personnel alike. The Comfort was not the first to be attacked. Earlier in the war, the Australian hospital ship Centaur had been torpedoed, but this was the most infamous incident involving American medical staff. Official reports confirmed that the ship's markings were clearly visible, and that she had been operating within her designated safe zone. For many, the event demonstrated how total war had eroded even the oldest maritime codes of honor. Yet the aftermath of the attack also revealed something else: that humanitarian commitment could persist even under fire. Survivors of the Comfort continued serving aboard other hospital ships, refusing reassignment to safer duty. Some returned to Okinawa within weeks to staff the replacement vessel USS Benevolence. Their experience reshaped naval medical training, leading to the introduction of stricter fire protocols, reinforced bulkheads around operating rooms, and emergency drills specifically designed for hospital ships in combat zones. The Comfort's ordeal became a lasting emblem of the contradictions of modern warfare. It proved that neutrality was not always protection, and that those who saved lives often faced the same dangers as those who took them. Yet it also demonstrated that the moral force behind humanitarian service could not be destroyed by violence. In the eyes of the sailors and nurses who endured that night, the Red Cross painted on the ship's hull was not a shield but a promise, a vow to act with humanity, even when humanity seemed to have disappeared from the world. For the rest of the Pacific campaign, hospital ships continued their missions under heightened risk. Each time they entered combat waters, the crew remembered the Comfort, not as a victim, but as a testament to endurance. The attack had taken lives, but it had not broken their purpose. The ship's survival, and the steadfastness of those who remained aboard, became a quiet legend among the Navy's medical service, proof that mercy, though wounded, could still outlast war itself. The end of the Second World War did not bring an immediate return to normalcy at sea. The Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were still filled with the remnants of war: wrecks, drifting mines, unmarked graves, and displaced people. For months after the surrender of Japan, American naval forces continued to conduct rescue operations, picking up survivors from sunken transports, repatriating prisoners of war, and evacuating civilians from remote islands and war-torn coasts. These actions, though logistical in nature, carried a moral continuity with what the U.S. Navy had practiced throughout the conflict: the obligation to save life whenever possible. It was this tradition, forged amid the chaos of war, that became the foundation of a new maritime humanitarian code. In 1946, as the Navy reorganized its peacetime doctrine, the Bureau of Naval Personnel and the Chief of Naval Operations issued revised operational manuals that formally codified the duty to render assistance to any person in distress at sea, regardless of nationality or allegiance. This was not a new idea. It had roots in centuries of maritime custom, but the war had given it a renewed and universal significance. The Navy's regulations made explicit reference to the United States' obligations under international law, including the 1907 Hague Convention and the 1929 Geneva Convention, and reaffirmed that the rescue of enemy survivors, shipwrecked sailors, and civilians was to be treated as a professional responsibility, not a discretionary act of charity. This doctrine evolved as part of a broader transformation in international maritime law. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States joined with other allied nations to revise the humanitarian conventions that had been tested, and often broken, during the war. The experiences of incidents like the sinking of the AHS Centaur and the attack on USS Comfort were discussed in naval legal circles as examples of how the absence of clearly enforceable protections had led to tragedy. When the 4 new Geneva Conventions were adopted in 1949, their second convention specifically reaffirmed the obligation to care for shipwrecked members of armed forces and medical personnel at sea, expanding those protections to include civilian victims as well. American naval officers and legal advisors played an important role in shaping these provisions. Reports compiled by the U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Office and the Navy's Historical Division drew directly from wartime experience, documenting not only acts of enemy aggression but also the humanitarian conduct of American crews who had rescued Japanese and German survivors. These records were presented during the drafting of the postwar conventions as evidence that even under extreme conditions, adherence to humanitarian principles was both practical and essential to maintaining moral legitimacy. In the years that followed, this principle became deeply embedded in international maritime culture. The United States Coast Guard, which took on an expanded global role after the war, incorporated the duty of rescue into its core mission statements. Naval academies and officer training programs around the world began to teach humanitarian rescue procedures alongside gunnery and navigation. The lessons learned from wartime rescues influenced not only naval policy but also civilian maritime law, culminating in the 1974 International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, and the 1979 International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue, SAR, both of which enshrined the obligation to assist anyone in distress at sea. In practical terms, the U.S. Navy institutionalized the wartime spirit of rescue through its continued humanitarian missions. During the late 1940s, naval hospital ships such as USS Benevolence and USS Consolation were repurposed for postwar relief operations in Asia, aiding refugees and repatriated prisoners. In Korea, beginning in 1950, the same ships that had once served in the Pacific returned under new circumstances, evacuating wounded soldiers, civilians, and even enemy combatants in accordance with the principles that had emerged from the Second World War. Their actions demonstrated the continuity between wartime necessity and peacetime ethics, the belief that saving life was not conditional on allegiance. By institutionalizing this duty, the U.S. Navy helped reshape the moral framework of postwar seafaring nations. Rescue ceased to be viewed as a gesture of compassion alone. It became a legal and professional standard. The oceans, once dominated by strategies of destruction, slowly turned into shared spaces of obligation and accountability. Every time a ship slowed to pick up a drifting raft or extended a line to a sinking vessel, it was acting within a moral architecture that had been built from the ashes of the Pacific War. The influence of these wartime experiences thus extended far beyond the events themselves. They redefined what it meant to be a sailor in the modern world, not merely a combatant or a navigator, but a custodian of life in a realm that recognized no borders. The quiet acts of mercy performed in 1943, 1945, and beyond had become part of the permanent code of the sea, binding all who crossed it to a single, enduring commandment: no one should be left to die in the water. The legacy of the U.S. Navy's wartime humanitarian experience extended far beyond the surrender ceremonies and the closing of military theaters. The lessons learned aboard ships like USS Comfort, USS Benevolence, and USS Mugford became the moral and technological foundation of post-war naval medicine and maritime rescue. In the years following 1945, the memory of what had been achieved, and endured, at sea shaped a new understanding of how human life could be preserved amid modern warfare. The first years of peace brought both reflection and innovation. The U.S. Navy, recognizing that medical care during wartime had too often depended on improvisation, began developing systematic doctrines for casualty evacuation and treatment. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery analyzed thousands of wartime medical reports, studying how shipboard hospitals had functioned under fire and how rapid evacuation had improved survival rates. The conclusion was clear: speed and mobility saved lives. This realization led directly to the modernization of the Navy's hospital fleet and to experiments with new forms of medical transport that could transcend the limits of geography and weather. In 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War tested these ideas in real time. The U.S. Navy recommissioned several World War II hospital ships, including USS Consolation, AH-15, USS Repose, AH-16, and USS Haven, AH-12, adapting them for new missions along the Korean peninsula. They treated not only American and Allied troops but also thousands of South Korean civilians and, on occasion, captured North Korean soldiers, a direct continuation of the wartime principle that aid must never depend on nationality. Conditions in Korea, with its rugged coastline and limited infrastructure, made sea-based hospitals indispensable. But the distances between front lines and the ships often proved deadly. Many wounded soldiers died before they could reach the safety of a hospital bay. It was in response to this challenge that naval medicine achieved one of its most significant advancements. In December 1951, aboard the USS Consolation, the first successful helicopter landing and medical evacuation to a hospital ship in history took place. A Navy Sikorsky HO-3S helicopter carried 2 wounded Marines directly from a frontline aid station to the ship's deck in the Sea of Japan. The flight took less than 30 minutes, far faster than any sea or land transport could have managed. This moment marked the birth of modern medevac operations, transforming both naval and battlefield medicine. The USS Consolation was soon fitted with a permanent helicopter landing platform, the first of its kind, and the system became a model for future hospital ships. The significance of that innovation went beyond technology. It represented the institutionalization of a principle that had emerged from the war's darkest waters: that the duty to preserve life should evolve as fast as the means of waging war. Helicopter evacuation symbolized speed, but it also symbolized moral reach, the ability to extend compassion into places once considered inaccessible. From that point on, naval medical design prioritized accessibility and rapid response, embodying the same spirit that had driven sailors to pull strangers from the ocean during the Pacific Campaign. As the Cold War advanced, this humanitarian tradition continued to guide American naval policy. Hospital ships became integral to global disaster relief operations, from earthquakes in Asia to typhoons in the Pacific. USS Repose and USS Sanctuary, successors to Consolation, served in Vietnam, often treating both sides of the conflict under the same ethical standard. Decades later, the massive white hulls of the modern hospital ships USNS Mercy and USNS Comfort would carry that same legacy into the 21st century, their red crosses echoing the ones that had once shone over the blacked-out seas of Okinawa. The legacy of these post-war missions was not limited to medicine. It shaped the collective conscience of naval service. Sailors who had participated in rescues or hospital operations often described them as the most meaningful moments of their careers. Their experiences reinforced the belief that technical excellence was inseparable from moral responsibility. The sea, they understood, was indifferent, but men and women need not be. The professionalism of naval medicine, the efficiency of helicopter evacuation, and the development of international rescue protocols all stemmed from that wartime confrontation between cruelty and compassion. By the middle of the 20th century, the principle that aid knows no enemy had become a cornerstone of maritime ethics. It was written into the doctrines of navies, the manuals of medics, and the hearts of those who had seen suffering up close. From the oil-stained waters of the Pacific to the cold gray decks of post-war hospital ships, a quiet thread connected every act of rescue, the conviction that the measure of civilization lay not in its capacity to destroy, but in its determination to heal. The legacy of the war's sailors and medics endured precisely because it transcended the war itself. It was not merely a chapter in naval history, it was a declaration that humanity, once defended at sea, could continue to guide those who crossed it. In the aftermath of the war, when the oceans had grown quiet and the smoke of battle had long since drifted away, what remained in memory was not the thunder of guns but the silence that followed an act of mercy. The story of the sailors who shared their water and bread with strangers revealed a truth more enduring than victory itself, that the strength of a fleet was not measured by the range of its guns or the thickness of its armor, but by the character of the men who served aboard it. These moments of compassion, repeated in anonymity across the vast Pacific, formed a moral countercurrent to the violence of the age. War had erased flags, names, and nations. It had turned the sea into a grave for millions, a space where identity dissolved into statistics. Yet in that same sea, the smallest gestures, an outstretched hand, a cup of water, a shared meal, reaffirmed the unbreakable link between individuals who had every reason to see one another as enemies. When sailors on ships like USS Mugford, USS Comfort, and USS Benevolence reached into the water to lift the exhausted and the dying, they enacted something larger than duty. They restored the idea that humanity could survive even in its own darkest invention. This endurance of compassion was not sentimental. It existed alongside fear, exhaustion, and grief. The men who offered food to the rescued often did so knowing that the same hands might soon be loading ammunition or tending their own wounded. The paradox was inescapable. The same institution that perfected destruction also became the instrument of salvation. And yet it was precisely in this contradiction that the essence of moral strength revealed itself. To act with mercy amid war was to assert that civilization still had meaning, even when its rules had collapsed. The sea itself amplified that lesson. Unlike the land, where victory could be drawn on maps and front lines, the ocean belonged to no one. It was a place that stripped away all illusions of control. Storms, currents, and distance humbled every empire that tried to master it. For the sailors who lived upon it, the sea became both a test and a teacher. It reminded them that survival was a shared condition, not a privilege. Whether friend or foe, every person who drifted in those waters was equally vulnerable, equally human. The decision to save them, therefore, was not only an act of compassion, it was an acknowledgement of kinship. In the long view of history, such acts were small, almost invisible. They did not alter the course of campaigns or appear in official communiques. Yet their influence ran deeper than any strategic victory. They shaped the moral memory of those who served, defining what it meant to win not only a war, but one's own conscience. Decades later, when survivors of these rescues told their stories, they rarely spoke of hatred. They remembered the taste of water, the warmth of blankets, the sight of hands pulling them from the sea. These were the fragments of humanity that endured when the rhetoric of nations had faded. For the sailors themselves, the experience of saving others often became the true measure of their service. Many would later say that the most important battles they fought were not against an enemy, but against indifference. On the decks of hospital ships, in the dim corridors of destroyers, and in the endless blue of the Pacific, they discovered that compassion required courage of its own, the courage to see beyond uniform and language, to recognize the universal fragility that war tried to deny. In the end, the legacy of those who rescued rather than destroyed became a quiet declaration of peace. It suggested that the first step toward ending any war began not in the negotiations of generals or the surrender of armies, but in the decision of one human being to protect another. When an American sailor broke his ration biscuit in half and handed it to a survivor pulled from a burning sea, he was not merely feeding a body, he was preserving the idea that civilization could still exist. Perhaps it was in those moments, fleeting and unrecorded, that the war truly began to end, not in the headquarters of power, but in the unspoken recognition that mercy itself was the final victory.